I was waiting for a couple of board members. With your permission, I'd like to alter we're going to take our three action items that are remaining, but then I'd like to alter the discussion. We have speakers here regarding lead partner contracts, and so I'd like to move them up in the agenda, followed by the public hearings on Year 5 schools, and that way that will allow my outreach coordinator, assistant superintendent, to be able to go and do some further work today, rather than waiting later for that one brief piece of discussion. So with that, we have freeway accreditation extension request. You already have the request to extend the schools that were due for this year for one more year, and you've got the information regarding that. Michelle McGowan and George Frampton are here if you have any questions for them, or I would go ahead and entertain a motion.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any more discussion? Roll call, please. That was quick. Thank you, George.
Thank you so much.
Well, we may vote no, so.
Yes.
Well,
Don't thank him for a good job yet.
his part's finished.
Yes.
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
I'm going to abstain. I missed the motion, and rather than vote on what I'm not aware of, I'll...
Take it from me.
Want to describe it again real quick?
No, I feel bad that it was my fault. I was late, so...
Well, you have the motion before you. It was to extend the freeway schools for an extra year.
I vote yes.
Okay.
Superintendent Ritz?
Yes. 11-0. Motion carries. The next item under action is board approval to order language from Hamilton Heights versus Fayette adjudication. You have that language that has been given to you. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any more discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Elsner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Abstain. The next item is the update SBOE staff job descriptions to reflect the new SBOE executive director. Is there a motion to approve the updated State Board of Education staff description?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Elsner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Abstain. We are now ready for discussion and reports, and we said we were going to take the lead partner contracts first. I want to let the board know that we're going to listen to things today, but it is the plan to take action in some form at the next meeting. So as you listen, make sure we get our questions answered and comments. So Teresa, I believe you are working with this with Michelle, is that correct?
So, good morning. So, Michelle and I have been working with the lead partner contracts and asking the current lead partners, as you know, they're your intervention. We asked them if you wish to continue for the next year, what that scope of work would look like. We sent that to you electronically for both Voyager, Scholastic, and TNTP. In having those conversations with the IPS administration, Dr. LeGrand met with us. And because they work with George Washington, we certainly felt it was important to include them in that conversation. In having that dialogue last Friday, we found out that actually IPS has a proposal for a transformational zone similar to what Evansville is doing with their school district. So it's a much more comprehensive plan, more than just taking care of the intentional needs with George Washington. It's actually doing a great deal more. So before making recommendations jointly that we would like to bring you in June, we felt like it was important for you to get that information today from IPS so that you could see that same option that would also be available to you.
And could you also explain to us the funding mechanism for these lead partners and where that comes from briefly?
So we're still working on that at the department. Michelle and I have had conversations with Charlie Geyer and Cindy Hurst in Title I, and we're still working on the funding issue. So it would be our hope that in June, when we come back with the proposal, we would have that answer as well.
But is it with SIG A dollars, federal dollars?
Some would be SIG A dollars.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, so can we turn it over to IPS?
You may.
Okay.
Welcome, Dr. Farabee.
Thank you. Is this device to operate? Okay. So, good morning.
Morning.
Pleasure to be with you again. I had the honor of addressing the board. I believe it's my first week on the job, transitioning to leadership in Indianapolis Public Schools. Pleasure to be before you this morning to present a proposal. I have with me Dr. LeGrand, which is our Deputy Superintendent for Academics. So Dr. LeGrand and I will share with you what we believe is a viable proposal for school transformation in Indianapolis Public Schools. That's a little bit different to the external lead partner approach that we have been employing. And this approach and our position this morning really is driven by two core principles. One, we believe that local interests should drive school transformation, and that the transformation process is most effectively achieved and sustained at the local level. Secondly, we also believe that it's important to ensure that the process is not a one-year destination, but it is truly a process of transformation. We believe that transformation requires continuous improvement and ongoing efforts. So it is a process that would be a 3 to 5 year process. And I think what we've done in the past is we've come out and studied this and studied implementation on an annual basis. And we've contracted with lead partners on an annual basis. We believe that work needs to be a stream of continuous improvement. So with that said, we'll go into our presentation this morning and outline more components of the model. So what we will touch on this morning are a number of items that relate to our internal proposal. So we'll first begin with the overview of our transformation model that we've established in the district. And as Teresa referenced, it does mirror lead partner model that's implemented in another school corporation where they're taking the lead on school reform. We'll also talk a little bit about the transition from the external lead partner model to the internal lead partner, how that relates to our own Department of Innovation and Transformation. We also give you information as it relates to our experience with transformational zone. We'll also talk a little bit about how that's transitioned into a model here in Indianapolis. And then we'll give you an opportunity to see the interconnectedness with the 8-step process. So we'll go through a crosswalk between our model and the 8-step process. And if you recall, when I presented to the board September and October, that was one of the things that we discussed as it relates to improving student outcomes at George Washington Community High School. We'll also provide some information on how our model compares to the external lead partner model that we have been employing. And then we'll talk a little bit about our investment that we've already made in our model and what we're seeking and funding. We want to ensure that you all are aware that we have skin in the game. We'll also give more specifics on the scope of work. What do we see happening from these investments? And then what we have in place as relates to monitoring. We, again, want to make sure that we're taking the lead at the local level with improving student outcomes. We also understand that we're assuming the accountability, and we welcome that accountability for improving student outcomes.
Dr. Farabee, would it be okay that we send this to the board later?
Yes.
Okay, so that they have this information. Thank you.
So we started our Division of Transformation in IPS, and we started a specific department that's focused on innovation and transformation. We hired a leader to lead that division, and we created our own transformation model. This model is really rooted in the idea that we're going to intensify our support for our schools that need more. On this particular slide, you can see how our internal lead partner model coincides with those beliefs. And so we want to ensure that we have a consistent instructional message for our school. We want to build capacity. And so again, one of the concerns that we have with the external lead model, when you have external coaches or supports coming into your district, when they leave, those supports leave. And so we want to ensure that we have a model where we're building internal capacity, we're capitalizing on our talents within the organization, and it's a reform that we can sustain long term. And again, we also believe that this will help us reduce costs because we're doing the work internally versus relying on external sources. This slide speaks to our experience with transformation work. And so on the top of this quad, you'll see a representation of data points on Guilford County Schools where I had the opportunity to serve along with Dr. LeGrand. And we established a enrichment region, and that was one of the responsibilities I had as being the lead architect in creating this model, is we intensified support for 9 schools that were struggling with student achievement, had a history of poor performance. And many of those schools, if you look at the demographics, their demographics mirror our IPS schools and some of the challenges that we are realizing in IPS. And you see the demographics on Indianapolis Public Schools. And then it's important to note in the last quad, we're lifting up our own priority school region, and that we have identified 11 schools that have been historically challenged with low student achievement. We're going to talk a little bit about how we identified those schools, but we believe that what we're doing with our 11 priority schools will mirror the work that we've done in Guilford County Schools and our enrichment region, and we'll see the same outcomes. So this particular slide here outlines the starting point and some of the data points from our enrichment region in Guilford County Schools in Greensboro, North Carolina. And you can see the overall improvement that was realized in those schools. You have elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools that were a part of this model. And again, we intensified the support in those schools. This was done internally within the district, and it was done with a lot of job-embedded coaching and an emphasis on professional learning. Again, you see more data points on just the gains that we were able to accomplish through this model. So moving back to Indianapolis Public Schools, these are the 11 schools that are in our priority school model. These schools were identified because they were a F in the year 2012 and 2013 as it relates to our accountability results. And what's concerning is not only did they didn't get to the magic number that you need to get to be a D, but these were also schools that had either negative or no growth at all. So not only are they not getting to the bar of proficiency to move out of the F status, but they're also schools where we're not seeing students growing. So we don't feel very confident that the students are getting the quality of education that they need and deserve in those situations. And so these are schools that we wanted to address first. And again, it's an emphasis on intensifying support for these schools, ensuring that they have the support, but also the accountability to improve student outcomes. It's also important to note, in several of these schools, we have already removed the school leader, or hired a new school leader since my 7-month tenure to ensure that we have the right school leader to move the needle. So there are 4 components to our transformation model, and I'm going to give you a little information about each pillar, but we're focused on staffing, ensuring that we're recruiting and retaining the best school leaders and staff to support the schools. Also, again, as I said earlier, intensifying the support that we provide from central services. We are providing instructional support, ensuring that we have the right climate, the learning environment is appropriate, and then we're monitoring. And again, that's that level of accountability that I referenced earlier. With staffing, from a central service perspective, we've already invested in professional learning and coaching, and we've also intensified coaching at the school level. We believe that all of our high schools should have a graduation coach. We should also have someone that's really focused on developing teachers' instruction in the area of math and language arts. Our instructional support strategies are really driven by our instructional framework, which is this idea that we're not just teaching our standards and moving on, but we're really teaching our standards towards mastery. So we're employing a mastery learning approach, and in this approach, what we do is we assess students' mastery, and if students don't master a particular standard, instead of moving on to the next standard, we ensure that there's time for corrective instruction or enrichment based on where students are. We believe that this approach will not only help students be more proficient in the accountability model, but also ensure that they have the prerequisite skills that are needed to move on to the next courses or grade level. As I said earlier, a lot of time spent on professional learning and around formative assessments to ensure that teachers have means of assessing where students are as it relates to mastering those standards, and not just delivering, but ensuring that there's mastery. Climate, as I said earlier, the learning environment is very important. We will be implementing a national model as it relates to positive student behavior to ensure that we are recognizing students that are exhibiting positive behavior, but also developing students in such a way that they're moving towards those behaviors that we're seeking. And we want to provide a lot of professional development there for teachers in our schools. Also to address staff morale, what we're finding is that in many of our schools that have been struggling with student achievement, we have very transient teacher population. We have morale challenges in some cases, so we want to ensure that we're assessing the climate of those schools on a constant basis to ensure that whatever's needed to improve there, we know what needs to be done and we can support the school leader in creating that environment. And then finally, as it relates to climate, we have to be more culturally responsive. We have a teaching force that unfortunately does not mirror the demographics of our student population. So we want to make sure that the educators that are responsible for delivering instruction know how to embed cultural principles, cultural awareness in their instructional planning to ensure that they're able to deliver the content in a very meaningful way to our students. And monitoring. Accountability, accountability, accountability. The accountability will dig deep all the way to a weekly basis where we are providing walkthroughs to schools through our coaches and our administrative and central service teams. We will have professional learning protocols as it relates to what we expect to see when teachers are collaborating and planning together. We really want to make sure that our professional learning time really moves away from discussions around things like field trips or operational items, but teachers really dig deep into unpacking our standards, especially now that we have new standards, and ensuring that they have a deeper understanding and it's a consistent understanding, and they use that information to not only plan, but also design their formative assessments that we're going to use to assess student mastery. On a quarterly basis, we're doing the same work. We're implementing quarterly assessments, We will have reviews of school improvement plans and student achievement plans. So again, we won't be guessing as it relates to how students will be performing or how schools will be performing at the end of the year. Through these weekly and quarterly checkpoints, we will always have our fingers on the pulse and on the needle to ensure that schools are moving forward and students get what they need. Here, we just outlined some of the correlations between our model and what we know about best practices as it relates to school turnaround. And so this particular slide gives you an idea of what the national standards are for school turnaround. If you look at these turnaround principles, you can see how we've embedded those principles into our IPS transformation model. So, you may be thinking, well, how is this different from what Scholastic has been doing, or TNTP, or Voyager, some of the external league partners that we've been required to work with in the past? Well, as I said earlier, one distinct difference is we own it when it's internal, and we are working with our own employees who are here, which I think is a tremendous difference and distinction between the two. But all of those models have a focus on developing school leaders. And we understand the importance of having a strong school leader, but our model as well is also driven by developing the principal as a school leader or the assistant principal and teacher leadership, which I also think is really important. Because leadership not only has to come from the administration within the school, but we're looking to develop our teachers where they have their leadership exercise and their expertise is used to move us forward. So here is a crosswalk between our IPS model and the 8-step process. And so you can see the 8-step process with the steps in each process focus on looking at data, instructional calendars, analyzing data. You look at the IPS model, we're doing the same work, but we're supporting it through our district and school coaches. And we're also employing our mastery learning model that aligns well with the 8-step process. Again, you see some of the connections between the two, as I referenced earlier, as it relates to climate. We're focused on student behavior and assessing the climate. Monitoring systems include our walkthroughs, instructional audits, and our quarterly and benchmark assessments, along with our protocols and supports. All of this, again, is aligned to the 8-step process. The next couple of slides will give you a cursory view of what the IPS model looks like and all of our components compared to what's been offered or what's being offered by some of the external lead partners. I think here's a good view of why we, again, believe that we are more positioned to take the lead. If you look at all of the components listed as relates to professional learning, leadership training, coaching, and again, I keep emphasizing coaching because if we don't have quality coaching, we're really not positioned well to develop our educators and our support staff to deliver better product to our students. So you can see here, while there are duplications in some cases of what we provide and what other external providers provide, you can see that we're well beyond those providers in terms of what we can offer. Again, in this slide, you see the same information. You see what we offer. You see some of the features of our external lead partners that we've been required to work with. As I said earlier, we want to ensure that the board is aware that we have skin in the game. And this is something that we started on our own to be very proactive with improving student achievement. So you can see here some of the investments that we've made from our general fund through our Title I dollars and through our Title IIA funds. So we've already invested and will be investing close to $1 million in staffing in some of our schools that are in our priority status. And you can see some of that's just increasing the amount of time that a school leader is employed with us. And so our elementary principals were 10-month employees. We don't believe that the principal and administrative team can show up when teachers show up and be highly effective. And so we are increasing the employment contract with those principals, so they're 12 months. And one of the things that I firmly believe through my work and experience with school transformation is that if you start the game late, you're always going to be playing catch up. And so we want our administrators to have a leg up, and we're asking them to bring in teachers early as well. So we will be working with teachers over the summer for a week before school starts on instructional planning and preparing for the school year. And the goal is when teachers start instruction in August, they've already planned the first few weeks of school. And so when we come back and have our professional learning throughout the year, we're always ahead of our instructional delivery time. And one of the things that I'm fortunate, my mother was an educator and she taught me really well when I was going to classroom that every hour that you deliver instruction, you need to spend at least 3 hours planning. And that's the type of work that we want to do as it relates to being really prepared and strategic with our work. So you see some of that professional learning embedded in our Title I dollars, along with the coaching. One of the things that I also want to lift up that's in the Title I box is that we also are ensuring that every school has a parent involvement educator. We believe it's really important that parents be involved in this process of school transformation and improving student outcomes. We understand that we can't do this in isolation without having the parents at the table. And then again, you see within our Title IIA, there's a focus on professional development and coaching. What you see here is what we are requesting in funding. So in lieu of dollars going to external lead partners, we're requesting that those funds be allocated to IPS to enhance the coaching services that we're providing for the graduation coaches that I referenced earlier. What's important about what we're doing with graduation and graduation coaches is we have a very lofty goal of not only increasing our graduation rate, but also decreasing the percentage of students that graduate with waivers. So if you study the recent graduation rate data, we had a bump in our graduation rate, but we also had a decrease in the number of students that are graduating with waivers. It's our goal to continue that trajectory to ensure that the waiver process is really exercised for those students that is intended for, and those students in unique situations where they cannot be successful on our state assessment. So we believe having individuals in each of our high schools that are in priority status that has that focus on attendance, grades, are you taking the right courses for graduation, we believe that's really important. And then, as I said earlier, the focus on professional development. As we talk about this investment, one of the things that I want to circle back to is I don't believe that it would be very helpful for us to come back to you every year with a new proposal, because I, again, believe that this is a process, a continuous improvement process. And so it's our hope that as we make our investment, that there's a commitment to make at least a 3-year investment in this transformation process. I think what's been frustrating for you, and I think been frustrating for us, is that there's this expectation after 1 year that the sky's going to fall and the magic dust is going to bring us to this point of dramatic improvement. And I believe if we employ this model and make a consistent investment over extended period of time, we'll see some of the outcomes that we're seeking. So here we've outlined some of the scope of work, and it may be difficult for you to see, and so we can provide you hard copies of this presentation, but you see that we're starting this work in the summer, as I referenced earlier, to get a head start on the school year. You see the work that's occurring in phase 2, which is from June to September, and then phase 3, which is from September to the end of the school year of June 2015. Here is a little deeper dive into some of the work that will be done. And again, that starts in June with identifying our strengths and needs as it relates to what work needs to be done next year. Hopefully we'll get our I-STEP results really soon, and we can start the data analysis process as well. As I mentioned to you earlier, we're starting training with our principals first and then our coaches and teachers over the summer, and that'll take place in June and July. And you see, as we get into the school year, we'll begin the process of analyzing school improvement plans, student achievement plans, and also helping teachers unpack standards to deliver instruction. And you also see some of our quarterly checkpoints as well. Again, I can't say enough about how this process is truly an ongoing effort. What you see, many of you may be very familiar with these principles of continuous improvement, but we believe that we must be in a cycle of plan, do, study, and act. And so year one, as we monitor and hold school leaders and our staff accountable, we will be adjusting along the way as we see opportunities to improve, and at the end of the year, we'll make further adjustments. As we move into year two, we'll continue to monitor and adjust, but then that's when we'll start to stabilize some of our efforts in terms of what we know is working and what we need to build upon. And then year three, we'll be at a point where we can make very firm decisions about what the model should look like and how we should move forward with implementation. And throughout this circle of Plan, Do, Study, Act, you will begin to see improvement in student outcomes. And we're already starting to see that already in some of our internal checks. But again, we want to make sure that as we make our investment long term, that you're with us and we're given the opportunity to address school transformation at the local level instead of having external parties come in and support us. So our monitoring systems, again, we want to be held accountable. We are prepared to provide monthly checkups or updates to the state board and provide the same level of reporting that the external lead partners have been providing. We're also prepared to provide presentations similar to this on a quarterly basis to give you a view of where we are in that circle of continuous improvement, and also share with you some information from our school improvement plans and some of the results that we're seeing from implementation. So I know I've given you a lot of information to digest. We also have an appendix that we can share with you as well, but we'll entertain any questions you might have at this time.
First of all, Dr. Farabee, I wanted to tell you publicly, I've followed you with great interest, and there are leaders who talk the talk and leaders who walk the walk, and you strike me as the one who walks the walk. I want to thank you already for what you've done in just a short order. The presentation you just shared, I would say to you, scores with everything I know about transformational change. I do have a question for you, because I think the strength of what you're proposing is you're creating these guiding coalitions of leaders who are going to create the relational trust in order to be able to challenge some of the deeply held assumptions that may find itself in the behavior that's going on inside the culture of various stakeholders. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you go about selecting those leaders, those coaches that you're talking about? Because to me, this plan hinges on who is sitting in those roles and their ability to challenge those existing assumptions with new assumptions about what really drives student success.
Well, thank you, Dr. Oliver, for asking that question. Thank you for the support. We're in the process now of revising our principal selection process policy, and that's something that our board will be considering for approval. And the reason I mention that is we believe that there must be buy-in for the school leader before he or she can be successful. And so we had a process of principals were just appointed by the administration and they're expected to go into school and do the work. We believe that the school staff and the community should be engaged in the principal selection process. And so we do the screening to ensure that we have quality candidates, but we've now employed a process where we have community members, school staff that are part of the principal selection process. They sit at the interview table and they're giving us feedback on why they believe a particular candidate is good for their school community, because they know We believe that that level of ownership and buy-in from the staff and the community will be very helpful as the principals do their work. Also, again, we're holding principal to a different bar, a different standard, if you will. And some principals really were not providing the level of leadership that was needed. And so we made changes where we need to make changes. We'll continue to be bold in that regard. But we believe just this beginning step of changing our selection process and scrutinize how principals are selected, we're being very stingy in that regard to ensure that we have strong leaders who can go into schools, who know the community, who can connect with the staff and parents and families. And we believe through those connections and through their instructional leadership, we'll see tremendous transformation efforts in their work and be able to bring in others along.
And that will be the same kind of logic then too, in terms of the selection of teacher leaders for instructional coaches. Is that fair to say?
Across the board, we are modifying our selection process. One of the things that I discovered early on as I would talk to individuals in our organization, very few individuals had ever even interviewed for a position. And so, Brad, I think you're a pretty good leader. Why don't you go over here and lead? And we really want to make sure that we're very thoughtful and strategic about how individuals are asked to lead and serve.
Sarah?
I'd like to first just echo Dr. Oliver's comments regarding your tenure thus far. As a board member who was here and present when the lead partners were first assigned, I can't begin to express my gratitude for this presentation today. I think it was always our intent that whatever program be put in place would develop into something that was locally owned and operated and implemented. This is exactly what I had hoped for when we led down this path in the first place. My question isn't so much for IPS as it is for the department, but obviously I'm very hopeful that our waiver issue will be resolved and that there will be no further funding issue there, but I also don't want to see a situation where, in the unfortunate event that the waiver might not be accepted, that IPS wouldn't be able to implement this program based on funding. So I'm just looking for a backup option in the unfortunate case that the waiver might not go through. Are we still prepared to give them the support that they need to implement this program for, I agree, it's not a one-year function. I want to make sure that we have a backup plan in place so that we can fully support what they have set forth here today.
Well, funding mechanisms for what we're going to talk about, which is what we're going to talk about here in a minute, is by school. And so, I assume Teresa is going to be talking a little bit about what that happens, because funding with some of our federal dollars comes via schools that are in certain categories. So he's identified some priority schools that he showed you up there.
Right.
And so that funding stream heads forth in that direction.
So if we lose the waiver, it does not impact the money that they intend to use and that they're asking us for. The 900.
First of all, everybody needs to understand there's no loss of money. Money's not lost if we lose the waiver. Some flexibility with the use of a portion of their money might be in jeopardy. But first of all, the department doesn't plan on having us in that shape. Second of all, the funding mechanism for the priority schools happens at by school level. So currently, in fact, I was calculating some things up here as you spoke, because your proposal for about $900,000, and we're currently looking at the request here for service. It looks like about $816,000 that we're currently. Well, I'm not sure that's what we're currently spending, but that's what's being proposed to be spent on actual vendors, outside vendors, TNTP, Scholastic, and Voyager.
Right.
So Dr. Farabee's, I'll make a couple of comments regarding that, regarding my overall piece for this. I want to also commend, because you have been so wonderful at making sure that we're working on the leadership issue. And even you and I had personal conversation about how to go forward with that, giving you even more flexibility to be sure that you had time to get in place who you wanted to get in place, and I greatly appreciate that. And then the actual total connection with the turnaround principles that you are aligning with totally. That is required in our waiver as the department has set forth to make sure that we are monitoring according to. So I just want to reiterate that. Thank you. Dan?
I want to echo almost exactly what Sarah said, but I also, I like this presentation, and I think we're going to get it electronically. But before the next meeting, I want to make sure we have clear quantifiable targets on student performance. And it's not a gotcha type of deal, but it give us all, from the teacher to the state board, everybody in between, what we're shooting for there, so we can see the progression rate over the 3 years. So I think we want to see that. I would also like to affirm, I was with Sarah when we went through this. We hired consultants a couple years before the takeover and the interventions. And it was amazing how some schools didn't even have teachers in place until October, and we were surprised achievement was low. They had a series of subs coming through for weeks, and I felt so sorry for the children. How are they going to be successful? And I just want to affirm your summer work to get prepared. These are not easy situations, so we have to come fully prepared. But next meeting we vote on, I'd like to see very clear, quantifiable progress, which I know you're inclined to. And then my thing would be to look favorably on this. I also like the investment that continues. I've appreciated the outside vendors' best efforts, and I'm not criticizing them, but this way you're growing your talent and hopefully takes root and stays in our community and connects with our neighborhood. So thanks for your past work. When we get ready to vote on this, I think my colleagues still want to see a quantifiable ladder up, and together we lock arms and go. How would that be?
Troy?
And I have to leave.
I'm so sorry.
Excuse me.
Troy?
Have a good meeting.
I just have one question. I really appreciated the idea of having feedback and presentations brought forward and through that monitoring process. But my question has to do with how are you going to present that to your communities and your public so that they're on board? Because we know that turnarounds, it's so important to get the community right behind you and support that. So can you address that?
So again, we've been very proactive, and we've already had those conversations, starting with our Board of Commissioners, principals, their school staff and communities, and the priority schools. So there shouldn't be any priority school that's on this list that it's a surprise today of the work that has been done and will be done going forward in those schools. But what's really exciting, I think, now is that we're seeing our parents take a more active voice in the transformation process, and parents coming to the table and say, hey, I want to be involved. What can I do? And then we have a number of community partners who also stepped up and want to be a part of this process as well. We have charged our principals with viewing community and parental engagement in a very different way to ensure, as I said to you earlier, that we're bringing people on. We have students 6.5 hours a day, 180 days a year. We know that we can't do that work alone during that time, and we need to have those individuals with us as we do that work. And so I appreciate you raising that, and it's something that we're committed to, and we'll continue to ensure that others are engaged. I also think Sarah and Dan stepped out for his comments as well, and we can share. We've already established pretty ambitious achievement targets for our schools this year, and we'll use that same model going forward. So we will be happy to share the targets that we've already set for our schools as what we expect to see in student outcomes.
Thank you.
Yes, David?
Thanks for being here, and it's great to see the turnaround principles being applied. And we've had many discussions on this board about what are those turnaround principles, and I think we've held our partners accountable for implementing those, and it's really great to see it on a presentation, how it's all laid out and how it's going to be done in Indianapolis. My question deals with, we've been focusing in on your priority schools, but is your plan to create these kind of principles in all schools in Indianapolis? Good leadership, emphasis on student achievement. Oh, we finally have someone else to speak.
Good morning.
Glad I asked that question then.
It is our plan to do it throughout the district. And so what we've designed in our reorganization is that we've divided our corporation into 3 learning communities. There is an East, a West, and a Magnet learning community. And each of those will be supervised by an academic improvement officer that form their own PLC. So many of the components that you see for the priority schools will be implemented within all of our schools. So the literacy coaches in all schools, parent educators in all schools, so that there's a standard. So the head start that the priority schools will receive is that we start their training this summer. The other schools receive the information. So during the school year, the principals meeting, the same things are occurring. The principals of all of our schools understand our expectations for next year. That's where several, not just the priority schools, want to start the work this summer. Just we're focusing our efforts on the priority schools.
I want to emphasize what Mr. Elsner said about assessment, and I call it an assessment dashboard of some kind, and I assume you're going to do it by school, an assessment dashboard, and maybe by region or throughout the entire district. And I just want to echo his comments that would be really important, at least for me, to see that something is in place. And the third point is that you're really changing an entire system and changing a culture. And my comment was going to be, how do you sustain that over time? But superintendent's comments about involving the community and building those infrastructures, I think you've answered that. Don't know if you want to say anything more about how do you sustain a change in culture, because research has showed us that the culture tends to return back to the way it was unless you pay close attention to it. So what are your strategies to maintain it over time?
So one of the things that we addressed in the presentation was just the shift in culture through professional development. But one of the things I would also echo is I have not allowed and will not allow us to continue to play the victim. That's been one of our challenges from my purview as it relates to culture. It's this woe is me. These are the students that we have. You know, we have 20% of our students in special education, almost 90% are for poverty. That's our student population, that's who we take and that's who we serve. And I think that's the approach that we have to take going forward. But also, again, to Troy's point, I also think it's something that we have to understand has to be done in concert with our community and our partners. And what's been refreshing as superintendent is very fortunate that Indianapolis is a community that understands the importance of K-12 public education, particularly traditional public education. People understand when they're thinking about moving to Center Township in Indianapolis, or businesses think about economic development, they don't look at the statistics of our charters or the mayor's portfolio. They go directly to Indianapolis Public Schools. And so the work that we do has to be an important conversation in every household in Indianapolis, because what we do impacts the quality of life for everybody. And the community has to lock arms with us. It's important to know that many of these schools that we're referencing today that have been challenged with low student achievement are not our schools of choice. So we do choice really well in Indianapolis. We have our charter environment, we have our magnets. I like to argue that our magnets outperform our charter schools, but what we're failing at is our neighborhood schools. Our neighborhood schools are the fabric of our community, and we have to have the community engaged in the transformation process to really sustain this work and make those cultural shifts.
One thing I'd like to add about sustainability is that it's all hands on deck. So there isn't an outsider who comes in, nor just the principal saying this is our process. It's the administrative team, principals, assistant principals, instructional coaches, all members of our academic team, graduation coaches, that in the school's leadership team, you all get together and work and become better, so that they're different leaders and all the voices are heard. And the same is important for us, for the parents. So that if one person is plucked away or leadership changes, it's a part of the fabric of the corporation and a fabric of the school.
So you're saying it's a system that you're going to sustain. It's not based on individuals. It's based on a system that's directly aligned with takeover principles and other best practice principles, and regardless of who the personnel is or are, then it should continue.
Yes.
That circle of continuous improvement.
Andrea?
I just have two questions. In the data from your prior school district, I noticed Bessemer sort of stuck out as not having the same improvement as the others. Is there something that distinguished that school from the others that you learned through the process?
We were a little slower in addressing the school leadership there in some of our other schools. We also saw a shift in the student population that impacted the outcomes as well. But I think if you study the data now, and there's a new leader there now, we see tremendous strides being made.
And then could you talk about what you mean by the national behavior model? Is this student behavior, or is this classroom strategy? What is that?
So the most popular one that I mentioned that people recognize is PBIS. So that's just one where we won't mandate that PBIS be the model, but we do want our schools to select a model. And so by national, it could be a model they formed as their own school, but every school has to have a model by which they provide positive support for students, guidelines, clear expectations for children, and also rewards for them and the staff when great things happen. And so PBIS is one national model that several schools within IPS and the state of Indiana have embraced, and nationally.
Okay, and I guess I do sort of have a follow-up. Will you choose a similar model for teaching strategy or classroom practice on the part of the educators?
So we will start with our instructional framework of mastery learning so that they understand the cycle. The parts that we will weave in, one component that was listed was gradual release, and so that it's way back when we were all teaching of me, we, few, you. We will make sure that's emphasized, so less teacher talk and more student engagement. And within those, there are technology components that we'll add by grade level, also by school, also by subject area, and those are the ones.
PBIS is positive behavior intervention supports.
Thank you.
Thank you. Teresa, did you need to make more comments regarding the presentation? Or what decisions and how this goes forth for the next meeting?
So you can see that's why we wanted you to see the option that IPS can bring forward as well to consider. And in June, Michelle and I will bring back a recommendation on funding potentials, and then a joint recommendation from our group for you to consider in addition to the lead partners. If you would like any of the external lead partners to present in June as well, we also would need to know that so that we can have them ready for you. So just some things to think about.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Teresa, why don't you just stay up there? And why don't we talk about the next item that I moved, which is the public hearings on year 5 schools.
Right, so we are wrapping up the school quality reviews in the 7 year 4 schools. We'll finish those in the next couple of weeks. So we're ready to move forward with the year 5 schools. As you know, under Indiana code, when a school reaches its 6th year of consecutive school improvement status, the board has an intervention they put in place for the school. So we have 4 schools that are year 5. So Michelle and I are needing direction at this point about when you want those hearings to take place for the year 5 schools. Are you ready to do those now, this spring, in June? Or do you wish to put off the hearings until fall? So we just, at your pleasure, need your guidance.
Any thoughts? Yes.
Are the schools in a position to do these hearings in the summer? Is that an option?
So that's actually, there's a history that had actually happened in June 3 years ago, before this first round was taken over by the state.
If they're prepared, I just think the sooner the better, because that gives them then the summer to work on things. If we wait until the fall, just as Dr. Farabee said, we wait until October, it's too late. We've got to move.
So we have kind of a consensus to go ahead and move forward with those in June?
Okay.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. So now I'm going to see the pleasure of the board here. We have SBOE staff updates, support for schools, the transition to new standards, an update on 1005, and then accountability update, all of which I think are brief items. So we can either go ahead and then have lunch, or we could break for lunch and come back. What's your pleasure? Keep rolling? Okay. So let's have the SBOE staff updates. What? You're going to use the restroom? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent. We only have one brief update. Just wanted to provide a little more background on Bob Guffin, whom you just voted for earlier to be the new Executive Director for the State Board of Education. I wanted him to have the chance to come up and just say hello and give you a thumbnail of his background, but just in case he doesn't brag about himself, I just wanted to let you know that he was most recently principal at Harshman Magnet Middle School at IPS. When he started there, the passing rate for students on the ISTEP was 28%, and as of the 12-13 school year, that grew to 73%, very close to the state average. He was also recognized in the 10-11 year as being the middle school with the greatest performance growth in the state. So I just very briefly want him to say hello. He will be reaching out and spending some time with everybody. He met with the superintendent yesterday. I just want to have him come up and say hello. Thanks.
Welcome.
Hello, everybody. I don't really have a lot to say. We had a great experience at Harshman, and the results happened because of an amazing staff that we were able to put together. They were tremendous and are tremendous. And I was going to say to Dr. Fair, if they get it right in replacing me, they're going to continue to be great. And
I'm sure they're sorry at their loss.
I'm hopeful they will. So I'm looking forward to meeting with everyone. I want to get with you individually and have you learn about me and learn about you and how to work with you and what are the best ways to have you hear my voice and me hear your voice so that we can do what you want done. And so I don't even know my email address, and so I can't tell you what that is. But, I got a text this morning that said, please send me your address. And I'm like, don't know what it is yet. So anyway, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to work with you. I appreciate everything you do and am learning in the last 2 days how much there is and how much you do. So thank you for the opportunity to serve in this capacity. I'm looking forward to working with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you. Support for schools for the transition to new standards. Amy Horton. I believe you have a PowerPoint copy.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Let's see if I can get this right today. So just wanted to kind of expand a little bit more on some of the presentation from yesterday. And we presented our first plan, I think, in early March. This is just going to be a continuation of that presentation, and the slides will look very similar. That's intentional so that you all can track from month to month where we are in the status of delivering on our promises. So the first goal, as we identified last month, was 100% awareness. And this was geared really toward recapturing attention if it has been lost through the public conversation and all the news media coverage of the standards. But the intent is to recapture educators' attention, to kind of put a new, fresh look to the standards. And in fact, we have a new logo, which is in use now. It's to the left. You saw kind of a mock-up previously. This is where we settled. It's a badge identifying that these are college and career-ready standards. The communications we're going to focus on are how the department is going to support educators and what they are ready and already know how to do. And that includes utilizing processes that they are familiar with in transitioning to the new standards, as well as teaching standards with which they're already familiar with that content. So the whole hope here is to not alarm folks, but to rather reassure them and saying that they know what they're doing, they've done this before, and in fact, the content they should be familiar with or largely familiar with. We are still promising to deliver on desktop delivery, and this concept is that we're going to provide access to information where educators currently work and live. And in fact, our intent is to kind of flip our communication mode so that we're actually using a lot more in social media, and we're going to supplement that information sharing with conventional communication tools. We mentioned last presentation that we do have preparations underway for the Summer of E-Learning conferences. Again, this reaches about 10% of our educators statewide. These are folks that are very, very active on all of the social media, and so we're reaching just beyond even the 10% of educators and all of the communities that they work in, so their networks, in other words. We have Go teams ready for the 19 Summer E-Learning conferences that will start in June, and up to 10 WIDA conferences. That's an addition from my presentation last time. The WIDA standards have been adopted, and we really fully plan to integrate our presentation on the new standards with the new WIDA standards. They go hand in hand, and so our teams are cross-functional from different departments, and we're really going to rely on those folks who have very strong competency in standards and supporting educators, as well as a great knowledge of EL students and students with disabilities. So we're really cross-pollinating our teams.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that WIDA stands for.
WIDA is World-Class Instructional Design Assessment.
What is
It's
that?
English
the
language.
new EL standards.
English language learners.
So English, okay, for English, thank you.
Yeah, they're English learner standards, and they're called WIDA. We also promised that we were going to be 100% responsive, and in fact, since our last meeting, we launched and have closed our survey tool. This was intended to be a needs assessment to the field to really help us identify and prioritize the supports we're going to be providing over the next couple of months. That survey, as I said, closed on May 10th, and here's the analysis. So we had 1,835 respondents, which I think was a really healthy showing. A majority of them, a clear majority, were teachers, although we did have others also respond. What we learned is that many of them were actually at the K-5 level, although we had a decent showing from 6-12 as well. And finally, it gave us really great feedback on what we're going to be planning on doing. So you'll see that these are the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 responses that we received, and they're not surprises. We were tracking along the way, and really the top 2 at least were ones that were definitely already showing to be the top demand. But in addition to that, we had a late push for resources for special populations, which is great, and we're planning on doing that anyway. I would say that this gives us just guidance on where we're going and what we're planning on doing. We're certainly planning to provide other things as we go forward, and we may actually even launch another needs assessment.
And Sarah, just to
Survey.
point out, because I know this was an area that you particularly wanted us to be sure we're looking at, is rubrics for textbooks, digital content alignment to standards, making sure that we're providing the proper support for that.
Right. Those are actually included in, if we look at rubrics for textbook, digital content, and alignment to standards, and that may even include a rubric for lesson plan alignment as well. So our immediate term goals in providing the 100% support, there are a couple of things that we know we have to do in order for folks in the field to do local development of curriculum and instruction. So the first of those items is standards correlation. We are on track to have an internal draft of the correlation documents for both subjects done by next week. And then our thought was to refine and tweak and review that, and then by the end of this month, have those finalized. I know that we may have some review by you all, maybe even by the roundtable, but our intent is to have all of our work done internally by the end of this month. In addition to that, we also know that teacher resource guides are something that are really important. This has come up in discussion items here and also with the roundtable. We are planning to launch, or we're actually already preparing our teacher resource guides with the intent of launching sometime in June. We expect that both subjects will have glossaries. Examples will be provided for mathematics. And a newer item that I didn't mention last time, because this is a newer item we're developing, is a text complexity rubric for ELA. It would be grade specific, and it would allow for us to give information to schools on a rubric for them to develop then local reading lists. So this is a really exciting new rubric that will take into consideration qualitative as well as quantitative measures and even task analysis. So the thought is that would be a pretty robust and comprehensive rubric for them to be using and developing their local reading lists from. We also know that we have to provide guidance for instruction and assessment purposes. We've done that in the past, usually on a quarterly basis. We intend to do that again. In terms of engagement, our big key to this is really leveraging local expertise, innovation, and practitioner perspective. We are hoping to develop this kind of free market delivery system where ideas are moderated by peers, and also by the department staff, but allowed to kind of organically develop and flow. And so we have launched a new web page dedicated to communities of practice. That is the website there, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So this is actually that page, and you'll see that we have identified different communities based on feedback from our staff as well as people from the field. We do expect that this will change depending on what the demand is and where we find educators feel most comfortable. But that would be the place where they would go to help provide support to their peers and offer advice about things that have worked for them, so best practices, as well as maybe even providing resources, their own kind of lesson plans aligned to the standards. So we really expect that we're going to get a lot of great input through that mechanism right there. Again, we did talk last time about having content evaluation and peer-reviewed resources. This is an example from our e-learning area where we've already kind of done this. So we're not reinventing or inventing something brand new. We're basically using what we already know from e-learning and then applying that to the standards. So this would be an example of a page where they would take a look at different items and then even make sure that there's a quality standard. So you see that logo up on top indicating that it's a quality standard. Again, the thought here is to have people not feel that they have to go to the department for everything, but to provide peer-to-peer collaboration across the entire state. And that again is our new logo. So I'll take any questions if you have any.
Sure. Sarah?
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate the work that went into the stages of the implementation process, and I think it's well thought out and makes a lot of sense. The one item that I had specifically requested in the motion made in March was for information to come forth to support schools in terms of agreements with vendors on supplemental materials. I know within my district when we had done a math adoption and then Common Core was adopted shortly thereafter, our vendor provided, obviously for a fee, supplemental materials that could be purchased to fill in any gaps between the standards. I think that's what I'm looking for at this point. My concern is that we have established these new standards, but if we don't find ways to help schools in filling the gaps in their actual curriculum, they're simply going to teach what the curriculum matched previously. Obviously, there is some overlap, but there are certain areas where there are gaps as well. So I'm curious if those conversations took place and where we're at on providing information on vendor supports for the approved textbook lists to our local schools.
So to date, we haven't done any work on that. I certainly would say that it's up for conversation, and if we are, if that's the will of the state board, we can consider it.
So why don't you go into in-depth more, because what we are starting to provide are the rubrics on which they need to evaluate what it is that they have and align with the actual standards. So what are you seeking for the department to do further?
And you had said in March that this was a plan anyway. What I'm looking for is for supplemental materials to be negotiated. I think that it's going to take the department doing it so that the schools aren't necessarily scrambling to try to find supplemental curricular material matching what the schools have currently adopted. Again, going to an example that I know because it's my life is first grade math standards add back in money. In our current math series that was adopted, there is nothing at all on teaching money. Now, obviously, I can go through and I can fill in a variety of ways. My concern is that if we don't provide options where I guarantee the same way they did when we switched to Common Core, our vendor was willing to create a realignment, some supplemental materials that we were able to purchase to fill in those gaps. I think that needs to happen again, and it needs to be something that is already negotiated and worked out at the state level so that schools have the option to.
Yeah, go ahead, Danielle.
So local choices, that's why we're going to develop the rubric. So first of all, schools can identify which of their materials that they've either purchased or adopted don't align. So that's the first step in this work, is that rubric. So schools can say, our chosen math materials.
Right.
What questions, critical questions, do we need to look at our math materials through so we can identify if we even need to seek a vendor support or seek a supplemental material? In terms of this idea of state power in reaching out to vendors, I understand your point exactly, but we don't have a process anymore of adopted textbook recommended for corporations. So for us to insert that power in the old days might have been over 5 vendors on an approved textbook company
I think we're saying
list.
two different things. I think what Sarah's getting at is historically, content area specialists within the department have been able to point districts to supplemental materials that they've reviewed that they believe satisfy your own rubric. And they've not said, hey, go adopt these. They're just saying.
But that used to
"Let
be
us-
when there
let
was a
us-
narrow list."
Let us save you some work and you can kind of go look on this pathway. So to me, it seems like if you're going to create a set of robust support materials, you're not telling them to use them. You're just, I think what Sarah's getting at is that if you got teachers already working several hours of a day and you got content area specialists already engaged in looking at this, it shouldn't be that hard for them to say, here's some things you may want to consider.
We can certainly put together some identified resources that
I think
may.
that's all we're saying.
But here's the thing. I think the world you're speaking of and the world Sarah is speaking of is a world of the past, when we used to have a very narrow
changed the
set
law.
of.
I
Here's
agree.
my
I'm not asking you to put out a recommended textbook adoption list. I'm saying,
Okay.
can we support the teachers by saying, we've got content area specialists within the department that know what represents something that mirrors the standards. That's all we're saying.
But I still think there's so many choices that I still think a rubric is helpful too as another supplemental piece. But if there's something we know is wonderfully aligned, then certainly we can issue that. I mean, like, for example, John Wolf, our reading specialist.
Right.
He probably has some great ideas.
Right.
But to say that we could help every corporation with everything they've purchased,
No, and
that's where the rubric, I think,
that's
would
not
help.
what I'm suggesting. And I'm just confused because in March, I was told that this was already happening and
The
and
rubric
was
idea,
in
right.
the process. No, in terms of vendor-created
I'd have to go back and see that. I don't recall. I know you
remember.
suggested it.
Yeah.
It's part of the motion.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that we use force to demand anything, but I think that it's easier for the department to have a conversation with vendors saying, this is how our standards have changed, what's available to fill in those gaps. Because schools who have already committed to staying with these vendors for, the 7-year cycle, again, I'm just thinking of my particular one right now. I know that I received, when we switched from the old standards to Common Core, I received a kit that obviously was paid for, quite heftily, I'm sure, that filled in any of the gaps between the standards. I'm just concerned that if we don't have some mechanism in place to provide support, and again, not mandating, not making a recommendation, but just starting that conversation with vendors, that students for the rest of this textbook cycle will simply be taught Common Core standards based on what had been previously adopted.
I would submit to you the field will greatly appreciate if you do that, because a content area specialist from the department calling, say, a half a dozen vendors versus 374 school districts calling a half a dozen vendors.
I guess I'm maybe thinking more broadly, because when you say half a dozen, I'm thinking about my own experience, and I'm thinking about my FOSS kits. My district was one of few that chose FOSS kits for science.
Right, they didn't
So would the
choose.
department know
Right.
to call FOSS, because it's used in 10 corporations? Pearson, CT, the big ones, absolutely we can reach out to and say, here's the Indiana,
Sure.
can we work with you? But it's those.
And I'm not
what
suggesting
I'm
that we
saying
do
now.
a survey and figure out everything that's being used
Okay,
across
good.
the state.
Okay.
What I'm suggesting is, at the time that, for example, going with the math adoption, a list was generated of suggested vendors to utilize, or approved vendors to utilize. Those are the ones I'm suggesting that we start with.
And you're suggesting the department had issued such a list?
They did.
Yes.
Yeah, and here's the thing, you could, if you wanted to do it, you could put it up in, like,
But
say,
not
Learning
recently,
Connections,
right?
Danielle, and if a district comes up with something additional to add to it, that lines to it and meets the rubric, then you can keep building that list out. But the department could see the start of a resource list that everybody in the state benefits from, and it's not requiring them to go with it, it's just saying, between the content area specialists and specialists in the field, I think I heard Dr. Friedis mention this one time, it's almost like a clearinghouse of what are the best practices and resources
Sure.
available to align to our standards. So you start building that up, and that's all I think.
And I think the department, and again, if it's the wish for the content people to do that kind of work again, absolutely. But I do think we have gotten out of the place of giving even approved anything or suggested
understand.
anything, just because we wanted to leave it to local
Right,
control.
and I agree, but we still have a
Because-
situation where schools adopted based on a recommendation,
Sure.
based on existing standards.
And
And I
Amy
feel
made-
like we have an obligation to match that.
And that's the same, I mean, with every adoption and every
Right.
standards. And Amy made a great point. So as soon as our correlation documents are complete, that also might provide clarity for all of us to see how far are we apart? You know, where other, like you gave the great example of money in first grade. Is that the only example of first grade? And if
Right.
so, a corporation may say, okay, we got this, you know.
And regardless, it's up to the district
So
whether
we
they
finish our
choose to use one of
correlation.
these supplements
Right.
or not.
So
But
she was
I
just
think it's
saying-
easier for the district to say, we made these few calls, these are created, it's now on you if that's how you choose to spend. Obviously, this was an unfunded mandate in the first place. There is no money to support schools in filling these gaps. I feel like the least we can do is help give them the resources and to do that legwork so that they're itemized. And perhaps if it's a call coming from the DOE versus one specific corporation, it's a little
You're
easier
just
to
looking
work
for, you're looking
out.
for some leverage.
Right, exactly.
So, okay.
If we know that it's a district or a statewide basis, our price is going to come in a lot more reasonable than one district calling.
And so I kind of misunderstood what it is you wanted the department to do. We actually started out by having them look at their materials
Which is
and
all very
see where the,
helpful.
where the
Don't get me wrong.
the
I
gaps
appreciate
are,
that.
so.
I don't think we're done.
Okay,
And as soon as our correlation documents are complete, then that'll guide that
sure,
rubric, and then we'll
sure.
be able to do the work
We absolutely could meet with the major vendors. That's not an issue, and if they want to, they're not going to develop kits unless they see that
The correlation
that
document.
the you know, with, well, or, you know, even with, that they're going to have a market, okay, depending on what people adopted.
In place, based on my
Correct.
experience with this, the transfer
Sure.
to Common Core, I think there's a mechanism in place to
Sure.
identify gaps and fill in. So.
Sure. Troy?
Well, I just know that when we had the vendors that were kind of aligned, I know the cost of the books were less because we had an agreement and an agreed price. The 10 to now, the price can be dictated individually. So I think that if you want to look at savings overall for corporations, I think that going back to that would be very beneficial because those were locked-in prices and you didn't have to negotiate.
And that's when the state gave out,
Correct.
when we used to have a system
Correct.
of blessing or
And
textbook
they-
list.
I mean,
right?
we're, right now, you're setting that cost onto the parent, and as parents, we're always trying to save a little bit here or there, so, I mean, that's something we need to consider.
Yeah, Brad?
Just a quick suggestion, Amy. This is the second presentation on this we've had from you. Both have been very helpful. But still getting a lot of questions in the field just in terms of what's coming next, what can we expect. If you haven't done like a voiceover or gone back and captured this out of the board meeting, I would encourage you to do that and send that out as a video link, either through the dialogue or even send it through the associations too, because I'm still getting a lot of teachers just saying, what can we expect? And obviously, I'm able to answer it from the slides and things, but I think if you've already got this presentation.
Oh, yeah, we can
captured it,
send that
I
out.
think
That's
that would
no
be
problem.
really well received because they're planning their summer staff development, and I think they're trying to get their heads wrapped around about what may be coming from the state versus what they're going to need to supplement
Sure.
locally.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Great suggestions. Thank you, Amy. All right, we are on to HEA 1005 update. Michelle Walker is stranded in Minneapolis due to flights. Amy?
Yes, so I'll attempt.
To kick us off, this is our second presentation on 1005, and you asked us to gather some information for you. So what you've got before you, and I think we gave you a copy of it. And so go ahead, Amy.
Thank you. So as the superintendent indicated, we left this last in April. You all should have received that April 1st memo. The second presentation is today, and then I believe the vote would occur in June. So I don't believe there's a vote today. Is that correct? Correct?
What'd you say?
There's no vote today?
No, we're
Vote
not
in
voting
June.
today. This is
Okay,
just
good.
discussion.
Just want to make sure we're all.
But we do intend to vote at the next meeting.
Great. So the April 1 memo, just so you know, kind of gave you an outline of the actual statutory language related to waiver requirements, so graduation waiver requirements for general education students and students with disabilities. And those are found in Indiana Code 2032-44 and 2032-45. They're similar but different for various reasons and for students with disabilities. But then from there, HEA 1005 modified those requirements. And what you see here is the language taken from that law that requires the state board to develop criteria to be used by the Indiana Department of Education to identify secondary schools with highest graduation waiver rate percentages that may require establishment of a school-wide remediation plan. So the law that was passed last year modified the statutes, and this is what we're dealing with now, is how do we implement toward that. In terms of the process, there is kind of a differentiated approach for first and second and subsequent year schools. And the first basically requires a notice to the school corporation and school and the submission of a school-wide remediation plan. When we get into second and subsequent years, we actually ratchet up a little bit, and then we require notice to school corporations and schools, plus collaboration with the Indiana Department of Education to implement and revise the school remediation plan. So it ratchets up a little bit in that second and subsequent year for when we notify schools of the situation and corporations. Last presentation, Michelle outlined these three options for you, and that's really kind of the meat of, I think, what you're considering at this point, which is whether or not you should go with a multi-year or a single-year approach to identifying and notifying those schools. So Michelle put together some data to identify, kind of inform the way you might consider which option you think would be best. So option A is basically requiring 3 consecutive years at 10%, exceeding 10% of graduation waivers in the school. And then option B is for 2, option C is for 1 year, excuse me. So we promised to do some data review, and we did do a collection of 5 years of data. However, the first 2 years, it was 2009, 2010, the data didn't match, so we had to take that out of our consideration. It had to do with the way we collected the data. So this represents, the review up here represents only 3 years of data for 11, 12, and 13. And basically what you'll see is that for schools with a higher than 10% waiver rate, we identified the percentage of the schools statewide, the number of high poverty, which I believe was a request that Mrs. Wicker made, to have a high poverty, which is defined as those students on free and reduced lunch. And I think we had, it's a higher than 65% free and reduced lunch rate. And then also we have the column for number of high poverty schools with 10%, greater than 10%, and the percentage of high poverty schools with 10% waivers. So she basically broke out all of the numbers and then the percentages next to them. So you can see that if you were looking at, for example, option A for the 3-year, what you'd see is that 64 of 369 schools, or 17% of those schools, would fall into that category of greater than 10%. The percentage goes up greatly with the high poverty schools, and that is because the denominator, so that subset of schools goes down. So you're going to have a greater percentage. I just wanted to flag that for you because it stood out in the data that we saw. So those are the 3 options that were outlined last time, and the next step would be for you to make a decision on which criteria, option A, B, or C, that you want. And then from there, we would go into the school corporation notification process. And one important note that Michelle wanted to make sure you knew was that the graduation statistics aren't ever finalized until late fall of each year. Right. So just be aware that there's kind of a data lag there, but we're certainly happy to continue to do some more research. One final note was that I believe Mr. Walker had asked for additional information about the number of high schools based on the size of the high schools, and we didn't drop that data in yet because we didn't want to subdivide the data even more. We can certainly do that in preparation for the June meeting. I just wanted to make sure he knew that we were addressing that.
So Amy, I just want to clarify something.
Sure.
So the school itself would need a remediation plan year by year, but getting into that category in the first place, we can decide if it's based on 3 years' worth of data, or 2 years' worth of data, or just a single year of data.
Correct.
So not that you're recommending that somebody's on a remediation plan for 3 years.
No,
You're
no,
actually
I'm
just
sorry.
So it's year by year that a school gets into this pool, perhaps,
Right.
but it's based upon how many years of data we're going to use.
Right,
Okay.
how many years they've been in that status.
And I guess I'm going to make another assumption, that doing it year by year with the lag that we have is probably going to cause a problem. So, I mean, just an assumption that I'm making right off the start. Carrie?
I appreciate breaking out the free and reduced lunch, because I do think that's interesting to look at. The other question that I had asked when we had talked about this initially was with our special needs students, and the inclusion of special needs students in that 10%. And if that's true, you know, you would have certain years where you would have a high number of special needs students, which might skew your data in an off year for some reason, if you had a population.
So do you want us to send, we can easily send that by email.
I would
So we could take this chart and then, Amy, we could take this chart and we could actually identify the number of special education students within this pool?
I think we can.
Is that what you're saying we can
That's what
do?
we'll plan on doing, and if we can't do it, we'll say so, but that's what our plan will be. And Danielle did ask that, you know, that may also be a reason to consider the longer period of time rather than a shorter period of time.
Right.
It just may, it may be a better indicator if we go with a longer period of time, but that's
Because
for
then you
all
might,
to-
a bubble wouldn't.
Right. You wouldn't fluctuate like that. It'd be over a period of time. Troy?
I just want to talk about the waiver process totally, because I know that we had a mixed feeling on the board of the percentages of the number of kids. As a principal of a high school, I'm going to give any kid that earns a waiver that did not qualify by passing the test that waiver because of one reason. Without a high school diploma today, that child will make $1 million less over his lifetime than the kid that has that diploma or doesn't have that diploma. And I think if we put too many stipulations on that, you're going to force schools to not give that kid that diploma, and they may be career ready and be able to be functioning in a community, and that one individual is not given a diploma because they don't want to get into this situation. That scares me. And you know, I put a remediation plan in every single improvement plan that I have because we want to have as few of waivers as possible. But I feel strongly that I will not deny a kid a diploma if he earns it by the waiver process. I won't be afraid of it.
And I guess, Troy, I would add to that, that's the whole intent of this legislative language, is to make sure that we don't have a mechanism in place so that you don't give waivers. I mean, that's exactly right. So I don't necessarily approve of it either. It's before us, and we have to do something with it. And so we're still seeking direction on what it is that we want to do with it. But I echo your sentiment. Yes,
I
David?
have a question to clarify the process. Once it's triggered, either after 3 years, 2 years, or 1 year, it says develop and submit a remediation plan. Is there an assessment of some kind that's done by the Department of Education, or is it just submitted and put up on a shelf and that's it? What's the mechanism to review that remediation plan and to get back to a district, or is there one?
Well, this is a new law, so I would say that there isn't probably a pre-existing approach to this. I think certainly as you all are discussing what option you want to go with, we can certainly start discussing internally which or what process or how deep we go. The first submission is less, it doesn't require collaboration with the department. So in the bolded, you'll see the first year, it says, upon receiving notice, the school is required to develop and submit a school-wide remediation plan, whereas the second or subsequent year, it says that they are to collaborate with the department to develop and implement a revised school-wide remediation plan. So I think the answer to your question is that we have not done that before, but we can certainly, I think, entertain options for how we might go about that. But clearly, there is a distinction between the first-year process and the second-year process.
Right. In both processes, there's no assessment component. You could argue in the second one that working in collaboration with someone is, in a sense, you're collaborating with them and assessing it at the same time. However, I would like us at least to discuss at another point in time this notion that someone reviews the plan coming in.
Sure.
What does the plan look like? Does it make sense? Is it based on best practices? We have turnaround principles. We have all this great research and all these great practices that are being done. I just want to be sure that someone other than us, they're going to take a look at it, and does it make sense or not?
Seeing as how a lot of this work, I think, is going to fall within my office, I would probably recommend that we develop our own internal review criteria, so at least we have it uniform from one school to the next. But you're using this word assessment, and I think, are you talking about analysis of the plan as it comes in?
Yes.
Not an assessment?
So I would say develop a rubric, an assessment rubric of some kind. Here are the criteria that any remediation plan should include. And then from a qualitative perspective, you need to build in some criteria for that too. So get that distributed out to the schools so they know what is expected, and when it comes in, there should be a review, hopefully from someone from your office, that'll take a look at, does this remediation plan make sense according to this rubric?
Yeah, I think because I don't see any problem with that at all, and I think that just makes good sense in terms of how we would go forward.
And we'll also need to keep in mind that we're going to be having a change of assessment. So what it is that we're assessing now may not be what we're going to assess later. So, you know, it's going to be what it is.
I have a question and comment.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tony.
Okay, so I'm still trying to process what Troy said, but Troy, so if you have two students that have a 3.0 grade point average through their coursework, one passed the whatever the assessment's going to be, and one didn't pass whatever the assessment's going to be, you're going to permit it in your school, both of them, to get a diploma. So what's the point of the assessment?
Well, Tony, there are students that are not great test takers. And so they may have attempted very closely and would be maybe 1 or 2 points short in that criteria there. But you would have to follow all the criteria that's set up. There's like 4 or 5 tiers to qualify for that waiver. But if they qualify for that waiver and a content area teacher in mathematics or English says that they are capable of doing grade level work with fidelity and all that stuff in their classroom, that is the intent of the waiver, to allow that person then to go on to have a successful career. They also can go on and go into college. So they still have all the doors open for them, and I don't think we need to close that door.
And I think that's sort of the easy scenario that I gave. My concern is on the other side of things, where it sort of lends itself possibly to abuse. I mean, there is a lot of discretion at the school level, but, you know, when it's all the way to the other end, when the care kid barely has a 2.0 or maybe not even has that, and still gets to graduate, at some point, doesn't it become unfair to the kids to actually work hard, make sacrifices, don't come home and play video games or go out with their friends and study, to walk away with the same credential?
Tony, I would address that I would treat every case individually, and no different than we do with an IEP, so that it is very important that you look at each case scenario separately and base it totally upon the rubric that was established for the waiver process.
Yeah, and if you're talking about special education students and special situations, but, you know, you have some systems where I've seen where the waiver diplomas almost are equal to the folks that are graduating without waiver diplomas. I guess my question to staff is, where does 10% come from? I mean, who sort of determined that, okay, 10% is fine, have 10% waivers?
I believe, and I don't have it right in front of me, I believe it comes from HEA 1005, so the modification to the base law. I'm being told by the attorneys that's correct. So it comes from the new law that is requiring this work.
No, he wants to know where the 10% came from. The threshold of 10%. We're looking it up.
We're looking it up.
Yeah, I just have really mixed feelings about this guy. I really sometimes the point that Troy's making, but at the same time, I think in places this is being abused. And at some point, you just start diluting the value and the perception of the diploma itself if these folks can go on into the workplace and don't really have the skills. But I'm sure no one that fits that field will come out of Troy School, but that may not be true for every school. Thank you.
And Tony, I am so sorry. This is Amy Horton again. I am corrected. We did the review of the data, and then that 10% actually came from that review. So it was kind of we were looking at the trends and kind of an average, and so the 10% came from that. And then from that, the plan, the 3 options of 1, 2, or 3 schools was developed and presented. So I apologize. It's not from the state statute, or from the statute.
Could be raised or lowered.
Correct.
That's the role of this.
Right, and we can talk about what we want to do even with that 10%.
Yeah, because maybe it should be 5.
But based upon the data that we were looking at, this seemed like a good place to be.
Yeah.
Carrie?
And that's, trying to think back when Michelle was presenting it, we were in the other room, and
Right.
she even said, once we see the data, you may want to go up to 13, because
Right.
maybe
Right.
13 is a number that when we look at the cutoff points is a more acceptable number. And so we did say there was some room for adjustment of it.
I do know that I had personal conversation with Michelle even this morning, and she felt comfortable with this 17% that you see over a 3-year in option A. She felt that that was a good number to revolve around our decision making.
So with that, then I think there are considerations to be had and discussion to follow, I guess, in the.
So what more information can we get to you? Because we'd like to make a decision on this next meeting. So the inclusion of special education students within this data that we presented, are you wanting us to go down to 5%? Are you wanting to see a higher percent? What is it we can provide for you? Troy?
I think, if anything, go up, just because I really think you're still at 17% over 3 years of schools. That's 1 out of every 6. That's a pretty high percentage. That's a difference. In my eyes, that's 1 out of every 6 high schools is going to have to submit one of these plans. That's just where I'm at.
So what we have before us, it says the number of schools with 10% waivers. So we had 369. Am I looking at this correctly?
For 3 years.
Or we had 64 of 369.
64 schools.
So 369 represents the number of high schools. Well, Troy, that's points well taken.
Can I ask Troy a question?
Yes.
What percentage is your school?
Oh, on which year?
Well,
It
yeah.
depends.
Okay.
I mean, it fluctuates from 5% one year to 25% another year, because of maybe your cohort is highly based in 504 or special needs students that would not qualify and would not be able to take it. I specifically think of a kid that was probably extremely intelligent but would never pass the writing portion because he was autistic and could not complete that part of the assessment successfully. Or I think of the kid that may be a genius as far as mathematical concepts, but could not master the concept of algebra because of a disability.
So would you be satisfied with the first option? Does that give you enough flexibility?
I think it would, but I would tell you this. I will tell you, I will be one of the 17% because I'm going to tell you, I will give every kid an opportunity because I know the importance of the economic and the global effect on that child. And we want all of our kids, our goal is to maximize their potential. And I will be honest with you, if they don't have a diploma, I have set them up for failure over the next 60 years, and I don't want to do that.
So there's some level, and obviously it's going to differ by school circumstance and cohort group, that is acceptable. It's acceptable to grant the waiver. And so I guess what we have to decide is what's the floor or the ceiling, I'm not sure.
And I do believe that all the principals that issue those waivers do it with the integrity of the way the rule was intent. They're not trying to slide kids by.
So our goal is to create a disincentive to take advantage of the rule, to allow principals with integrity to continue to grant waivers.
Correct.
And so, to me, the 3-year standard is a good one because it gives you flexibility for those
It gives you a little bit
difficult
more
cohort
flexibility
groups.
than 1 year.
So are we looking at showing you a different percentage? It's 10 right now. Are we looking at something higher? We can provide you with whatever you want.
Can I answer that this way?
Yes.
What would really be helpful, and I'm grateful that Troy is on the board as a high school principal, is running those percentages by a group of actual high school principals, people from the field who can help us look at this and understand the impact when you start putting students through this model. Because we heard from I think the principals at Zionsville, I think Brownsburg that were here. That would be a greater help to me as a board member to hear from the field and get some kind of recommendation back on each of the options. And if there's a recommendation from them to vary that percentage and their rationale for that, that doesn't commit us to agreeing with them. It just says we've listened to what the field had to say and how it impacts them.
I don't think Todd's here. Steve, is that something, because we've had conversation about this already with the Indiana Principals group, so is that something that we can gather information on? Because we've had conversation already.
Can you get that and email it to us?
Yes, we can. So we'll talk about how to gather that information and we'll get it to everybody. As long as principals understand we're having to do this. I mean, it's not an option to not do it. Sarah?
I certainly sympathize with Troy's point, and it brings a perspective that I'm glad you're here and putting it forth in that manner. But I think it's also at the same time important for us to keep in mind the reason this was enacted in the first place. By no means do I want to see us devaluing the diploma either, and I think that we need to keep in mind also the amount of remediation that we are looking at as students are entering college. So while I certainly don't want to put anyone at a long-term disadvantage, I also want to make sure that we keep in mind that this happened, 1005 was put in place in the first place because of a serious issue in the amount of remediation and the amount of time required then for students to actually complete a degree. So I think it's a fine line, but I think we need to keep in mind that that's where this stemmed from in the first place.
I just know that on the college front, I feel like the number of students attending college, the pool may be different than when I attended, as there was rejections and different things. And so there was less remediation because you got the best of the best.
Right.
And I think that today, we've opened it up to encourage all kids to have that opportunity, which I really believe in anyway, because there's great things that can happen. And I think that, you know, as I look at it, that's personal choice.
Right.
As I send a son to college, if he has remediation that he has to take, it's because his learning needs that remediation.
Right.
We have to remediate in high school. And so I just feel like it's a commonplace, and there's a lot of IEPs that follow kids into college, which is what we're basically doing at the high school level as an individual plan for all students, not just special ed students.
And I fully agree. I think we're on the same page, and I certainly don't want to close doors for anyone, but I also don't want to give false hope as to a child's readiness. From a parental standpoint, I want to know up front, I don't want my child to have the door of college or higher education close to them, but I want to have a real understanding of exactly what's going to be necessary as they're transitioning there as well.
All right, so I think we have a part of the plan. We're going to gather some information from the principals in the field, but then I also sense that we'd like to see some more data beyond the 10%. So maybe what we'll do is what I've seen the vendors do for actual approval of cut scores, that we give you, here's some options and here's what it looks like, and then we can narrow that down. David?
Thanks. We talked about data that we need, and I'm really curious about the waivers that have been given. And maybe looking at the percentage of waivers that dealt with special education. My colleague, the ones he gave as examples, were 100% special education. Are they really 100% special education for waivers, or are there? What are the reasons? Special ed I can understand, but what are the other categories? I'm concerned, as some of my colleagues, that maybe this is being used for other reasons. And I just think it's important to look at the reasons why we're giving these. To say that it's on a case-by-case basis, I understand that and applaud that. But what does it mean on a case-by-case? Can a student come in and just say, well, I'm from a bad family background, or I'm in a community that doesn't value education, therefore I should get a waiver and it's granted? I don't think that's the spirit of it, and I'm not saying that happens at all. But we really don't have that data. Is that possible to get some clarification on
Well,
that?
let me clarify something. First of all, there's a very stringent process to get the waiver. So, and Troy could probably explain that, but you have to go through a variety of things to even give a waiver. So it's not like you just decide to give a waiver. But I'm not sure we collect that kind of data. I'm not sure what the data collection looks like regarding the waivers.
It sounded.
Are included in our school graduation rates,
Yes, they are. We report both. We report it with it and we report it without it. But I'm talking about the actual information itself and how disaggregated we might be able to get regarding who got the waiver.
Yes.
And the why, they have to follow the process.
I understand they have to follow the process, but what was said today really opened up my mind, so there seems to be great ambiguity and great flexibility. For example, how many students don't get a diploma from your school, either through a waiver or by actually going through the coursework?
Last year, out of my 96 candidates for graduation, 93 successfully received a diploma. However, since graduation and the return to school, I've had 2 of the 3 return to school and earn a diploma. So, I mean, there's all kinds of criteria that you have to have, but I will tell you this, we follow the criteria to the T. They have to have these things checked off. If they are not in compliance to every single area, they are not allowed, and so then they do not receive a diploma. But they do have to qualify for that C average in 40 or the core classes, and that is a calculated GPA. If they don't qualify there, they immediately go back. I have had kids that did not qualify for that, however, returned to summer school so that they could get a grade higher, so that they could possibly earn a diploma. And I think those are things that schools are doing to protect the integrity of that system.
And that's good news, and I'm glad you clarified, because my initial impression was not what you just said. The goal is to increase graduation rates, and if they do have to go back and get some additional help, or the school provides some remediation, that's terrific. I think that's what we're trying to do. But with the disaggregated information, I understand you don't collect that, or
So-
Debbie was going to say something?
Yeah, Debbie does our data collection. She can tell you what we can collect and match and what we can't.
Okay.
Madam
Good
Superintendent.
afternoon. So we do collect information concerning special education by an SDN number. We also do collect information on who received a waiver by SDN number. So by matching those two components, we could indicate who was reported again on special education collection that also received a waiver. So we can aggregate the data that way.
That would be terrific. I'm just looking at the differential between special ed students who received the waiver and all other people who received the waiver, and if there's any way to dive down into that cohort group to figure out exactly on what basis did they receive it. I'd be curious to see that.
Sure. I was just commenting to Amy also that we may have a unique opportunity here to provide some additional data utilizing our SLEDS program, statewide longitudinal data system, to be able to see the outcome of the students that received a waiver versus students that did not receive a waiver in higher ed as well as workforce. So we'll have to work through the SLEDS program and SLEDS team to see if we can get that information. But I think that would be very useful information to see what those outcomes look like.
Very useful. Thank you.
Brad?
I'd like, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. One other distinction, though, I think it's an important one, is we don't have data. We couldn't collect data between the number of waivers sought versus those granted. So all we see on our end is how many received waivers. So I don't know if that touched on one of your points earlier. I think I heard shades of that.
Right.
So I wanted to make sure you understood what we can and cannot do.
If you don't have it, you don't have it, but that other information would be very useful.
Okay, we can certainly do that. Sorry.
That's okay, Madam Superintendent. I'd like to ask council a quick question if I could.
You may.
Michelle, can I ask you something real quick? When we were moving along there about 200 miles an hour, I looked over and we were talking about things we were using terminology, and I've learned that when I see you turn green and I don't understand legalities, I probably should ask you, was there something there that we need to be mindful of on the legal side of this?
So there is one distinction that I want to clarify when we're talking about students with disabilities. So the waiver requirements are set forth under 2032-44, generally speaking, but then 2032-45 specifically addresses students who have IEPs, and it's not even really an option. The statute provides a right to a diploma with a student with a disability if that student's case conference committee determines that the student should graduate, and then the student does have to meet the other requirements, which everyone's sort of alluding to, but just for the sake of clarity, and I believe that Dr. Walker went through this last month, but they have to maintain an overall C average. They have to attempt to take the assessment each year that it is offered. They must maintain a 95% attendance rate. So the idea of the kid who just doesn't come to school and doesn't pass and then gets a waiver, that's inaccurate. It's prohibited under the statute. And then, as Mr. Albert alluded to, the subject content teachers are required to sign off. So it puts the onus on the